So, I've been working on the script for my character analysis / headcanon of the characterization of Steve Rogers, aka Captain America. Probably my favorite of the core 6 Avengers. Something that took me a long time to settle on, honestly. For a while now, for several weeks longer than I expected to. Because I just kept throwing out everything that I came up with every time I was almost finished. Because I just didn't like where it was going. I ended up doing one of two things. Either just listing out milestones in Cap's life, or trying very hard to justify some of the writing decisions made about him in Endgame specifically. And I still am going to end up doing the latter thing in this video a little bit, but I think I've managed to work out a version of the script where I don't dwell on that too much and make it totally unbearable. Because even if I don't like the entirety of how it was executed, I do like where Cap ended up. And believe me, that is a thing that I thought on for a very long time, so all of you Steve fans, rest assured that I'm not making that statement lightly. And the thing that helped me come to this decision, the thing that helped me realize that I'm okay with where Steve ended up, was my description of Steve. I decided to write out a description of Steve, a really simple 1 to 2 sentence description of Steve as a character that I could use as sort of the hook for this video. And once I had whittled that description down to the simplest form that I could, the form that it ended up taking helped me to understand not just why I was leaning towards liking the choice that the Russos made for him, but also understanding, I think, why the Russos chose to take him there in the first place. And that's that Steve Rogers is the Avenger who most deserves to live a quiet, uneventful life. Yes, even more than Hawkeye. Because at the end of the day, Steve Rogers is the best Avenger. And I don't mean like the most powerful or the most effective. I mean, in terms of his general goodness, he is the best Avenger. And that doesn't mean that everything he does is always lawful. It doesn't mean that everything he always does is always, I would even argue, right. It just means that in my view, his motivation for doing everything that he does is always the most, purely good. It is always the best intentioned. And that is because even when Steve Rogers makes decisions which seem to be, in some ways, self-serving, if you dig just a little bit deeper, it's always clear that he's making those decisions for someone else. I would argue that the most selfish things he ever did was, first, acting directly in the defense of Bucky in Civil War, and second, choosing to stay back in the past and create a new timeline where he had a future with Peggy. With the latter obviously being more selfish than the former, because Bucky, even if they had intended to bring him in without harming him, could have very easily been harmed or even killed in the struggle to escape from those who were pursuing him. Peggy, on the other hand, at least in the main MCU timeline, had her own life that she lived apart from Steve, and while a part of her never got over him, we could tell that pretty clearly in his one interaction with old Peggy, she was happy for at least most of that time. And if they had actually gone all the way with it and had Steve retcon the entire timeline by staying in the past and somehow erase the life that she had, I'd be a lot more upset about it. But that's not what happened. The Russos have confirmed that when he stayed back in time, he created a branch timeline where he and Peggy had that life, and then he used means that existed within that timeline to get back to his original timeline once he had lost her. And Steve Rogers absolutely, by that point in his life, deserved to make that selfish choice. And I will die on that hill. But before I offer myself up to be slaughtered in the ensuing battle, let's take a step back and analyze Steve as a character and what his motivations are, at least as far as I've interpreted them, so that I can at least try to convince you guys of where I'm coming from, while still at least mostly sticking to the formatting rules that I set forth for this series back in my Hulk video. The fact of the matter is, I never saw Steve as someone who wanted a life of violence and conflict. And that may seem obvious to people, but I still think it's important to say it out loud. Because if you look back at Steve, when he was first trying to join up with the army, and was, as a result, subsequently scouted for the Super Soldier Project, well, he wanted to join up and do his duty to fight for his people and what he thought was right against people who he definitely didn't think were in the right. It was out of a sense of duty and right and wrong, not because he wanted to be out on the field hurting people. And that's why, at the end of the day, the best weapon for him is a shield, an implement with which to protect others and himself first, which can also be used to bash people's heads in if he really needs to. Because at the end of the day, Steve Rogers didn't want to be a sword cutting down people he disagreed with. He wanted to be a shield protecting the people he did agree with from the harm that others could do to them. That's why the most profound moment of Steve Rogers in his initial movie appearance, I think, is when he jumps on that grenade, shielding the people around him at the expense of himself. And that says everything you need to know about his character, that he is the kind of person who gives and gives and gives until there is nothing left to give, just so that the people around him don't have to give anything of themselves, at least as far as he can help it. And I will freely admit that I love this kind of character and want good things for them. My main character in my upcoming book series is very much like this, though her morality is a little grayer than Steve's, but you'll have to read the book to get a real feel for that. Like, let's look at the scene at the end of First Avenger where Steve plunges the attack plane into the ocean in order to save a whole bunch of people in America. This is effectively the exact same scene. In that grenade scene, Steve could have kicked the grenade away, hoping to knock it into a spot where the shrapnel and the explosion wouldn't harm anybody, but he didn't. He didn't take that risk. He instead did the thing that he knew for sure would save as many people as possible, which is exactly what he did in that plane. He brought it down to the ocean rather than trying to divert it or land it somewhere else or drop its payload somewhere else, because he knew that was the most surefire way to save as many people as possible. And the one casualty, himself, didn't factor into his mind. The difference being that by the time that final scene in the plane rolled around, he had something to live for above and beyond just himself and his one, maybe two friendships. And as much as I think that Steve loved Bucky, he loved Peggy, I would argue, more, and definitely in a different way. I know there's a lot of Steve Bucky shippers out there. I get why it's a thing, but that's just not who the character was. I'm sorry. So that little bit of extra hesitation that we see when he's about to down the plane is understandable. Simply from that perspective, not even considering the fact that he had more time to think about what he was about to do in that latter scenario rather than the former one, because it's a freaking grenade. It's a much more urgent thing than a plane that hasn't reached its destination yet. And I could talk about other instances throughout the other movies, but I don't even feel like I need to, because unlike all of the other Avengers, and yes, I do mean all of the other Avengers, Steve didn't really change that much. Like, there were definite hints that his perspective had been broadened as each installment came along, but he didn't change much as a person. And I think it's worth it to take a brief aside to point out why that's a good thing. Because I mentioned in my last of these MCU analyses, the one of the Hulk, that his character doesn't really change over time much once they sort of establish the bare bones of his characterization. And I know it can probably sound like I'm saying the same thing about Cap, and I'm absolutely not. His character does grow and change. It's just the kind of person he is doesn't change, because he didn't need to change the kind of person he was. Banner needed to grow and change into someone who could accept the Hulk as more than just a liability, a danger. Hulk needed to grow into someone who could better restrain himself and better handle himself around other people. Taking an example from characters that I haven't talked about yet, Tony needed to grow and change as a person into someone who was less self-absorbed and arrogant, something which I would argue he may not have ever actually done, but we'll get to that when we get to him. Though at the very least, he was tempered quite a bit, because all of these people, despite the fact that they did heroic things, were not really ideal heroes at the start of their arcs, but Cap was. Cap is the paragon hero. So while he needed to grow and change, the kind of person that he was never needed to grow and change. His outlooks did. And they did, so I'm satisfied. I would actually say that the most that he changed was that his trust in the government and government institutions was deconstructed over the course of his arc. At the start, he seemed pretty diehard in his belief that America was the good guy, but by the end, his view of things was definitely significantly more nuanced than that. Especially since saying that Steve thought that America was the good guys isn't even entirely accurate. I I mean, first Avenger was set in World War II, and I definitely feel like America and the Allies were more the good guy than the bad guy there. But nobody's perfect, no government especially is perfect, and Steve was never jingoistic or anything. It's primarily, as he said, he doesn't like bullies. Germany in World War II was, to put it very, very simply, a bully. So when things began to turn around and various forces acting within the United States started to come off as equally or even more bullyish than that, kind of like the giant flying genocide machines in Winter Soldier, and then the Sokovia Accords, which I would argue did have a purpose but could be abused for other things. Of course, Steve wasn't going to remain blindly loyal to America anymore. He couldn't and still be Steve Rogers. And we see indication of that as early as his first appearance in the Avengers, where he's brooding, punching a punching bag into powder. Because Steve brought that plane down thinking that he was saving the world, and that from that point forward, the people who were in the right would be able to win the conflict to come and make the world a definitive better place. Then he woke up in the overwhelming and confusing world of the relative present, and he finds out that there are still groups, some of them homegrown, seemingly, which still seem to believe that making the world a better place means putting giant flying genocide machines up in the air and snapping people out of existence. And so his faith undergoes a shift from institutions to individuals who he knows and trusts, people who have proven themselves to him and to the world, and so he is able to put his faith in them and trusting them to be a force for actual positive change in the future. He was able to remain the person that he was at his core while still incorporating those changes, those tweaks to his worldview into his overall outlook. And that, at the end of the day, is why I think he took so long to retire. By the time the threat of Thanos was undeniably imminent, he didn't really trust anyone aside from himself and the people that he had formed bonds with to actually do anything about it. And that's why once the threat that Thanos had presented had passed, and he was sure that he had people who he could trust to take up his mantle, he was finally okay with retiring. And even then, I still don't know that he would have retired if he hadn't had the possibility of pursuing that relationship with Peggy that he never got to have. Because I don't think young Steve Rogers, newly Captain America Steve Rogers, ever intended to retire, ever intended to stop fighting whatever fight came his way, no matter what, until he met Peggy and realized that he wanted to retire with her. And just to get out of the way right now, I want to say, in preparation for when I talk about him and Peggy and their renewal of their relationship properly, I don't think he went back in time intending for it to happen. I think he probably stumbled upon the opportunity to talk with her and realized they could make it work and went ahead with it. But again, I'm getting a little ahead of myself. I just wanted to make sure you guys understood that that's my headcanon regarding the situation. But anyway, that faith in people over institutions, that aspect of Steve's character, that's why it was so important for him to pass the shield on to Sam in Endgame and not later on in a supplementary work or another movie. And if he was going to be in the past anyway, and if the movie has already established that you can't actually change events that have already happened, you can only create new events that are different, of course he's going to, at the very least, talk to Peggy and see if she is open to the idea of trying to make what they have work. Yeah, she's grown as a person, but he's grown as a person too. And for all the people saying that he would have had to hide and not change anything, not affect anything for this to work, that's ridiculous. Of course he wouldn't have had to do that. For all we know, that alternate timeline where he and Peggy lived together for all that time is some sort of paradise compared to the main MCU timeline, because he was able to warn people of dangerous events before they happened. And I want to be clear before I say this next thing that I absolutely believe that even quote-unquote retired, he's the kind of person who would try to make things better for everyone around him. But even if he didn't, I still think he deserves that. I still think he deserves that quiet, uneventful life. That dance that he never got to dance with his sweetheart. But I still think that the execution of it was pretty poor, simply because we don't see them come to the decision to try this and make it work, despite the strange circumstances they had found themselves in. It's obvious that the Russos wanted the reveal of Old Man Steve to be a surprise, so they didn't hint at all, aside from that one brief moment when Steve saw Peggy and she didn't see him somehow, that something like this might happen. For the sake of a twist, they robbed us of characterization, because absolutely, Peggy should have had some say in this decision as well, and I believe that she did, off screen. Don't get me wrong. But the fact that we don't see it, that we are given no indication as to what form it would have actually taken, it robs her of agency in the story, agency that she definitely should have had in a more overt manner. And what's worse is this issue could have been solved with the addition of 2 small scenes. Firstly, back when Steve saw Peggy through that window while he was in the past trying to get, the Space Stone, I think. Instead of her just conveniently not noticing that he was right there, she should have seen him. She should have looked up, and he should have had to duck out of the way really fast, worried that she's seen him and it'll screw up the timeline, even though at that point he should know that it would only split the timeline, not actually mess it up. And he stays hidden for a couple minutes. Maybe we cut away to Tony for like a brief check-in so that there's the indication that some time has passed. Then we cut back to Steve when he goes to leave, and Peggy's waiting for him outside the room, boxes him in, and forced him to have a conversation with her. And there's like a cutaway with an indication that he's caught her up very quickly on his story up to this point and how he got there and stuff. There's a moment of silence. The two of them are just kind of looking at each other. Then Steve's like, "I'm so glad I saw you again. I'm so glad we got to talk again. But I have to go. I have to go back. Tony's waiting for me." And Peggy's like, "I know, Steve, I know you have to go back." But then in a moment of weakness, she says, "But what if you didn't? What if you stayed?" And like, obviously, he couldn't have actually stayed because he had a mission there that he was trying to accomplish. And she would know that too, but that's not really the point. This is a moment of weakness for someone who otherwise wouldn't suggest someone neglecting their duty like that. And Steve recognizes that. He's like, "You know I can't." Maybe he even tries to brush it off, saying, "Even if I did stay, I would just split the timeline. It's not like I could fix anything." Giving her a chance to save face and pretend like she was suggesting he stopped Thanos in the past. But in that moment, she realizes that she really does want it back. Even if it's impossible, she does want that. So she says, "That's not what I meant, Steve. I know you couldn't fix anything. I know you couldn't stop it. But we could be together." But he says again, "I can't. I have to make sure everyone gets brought back. It's the right thing to do." And Peggy says, "Of course you do, Steve. You always do the right thing." And you can hear it in her tone and see it in her face that she both admires him for that and also still kind of resents him for that, because he's making the same choice he made before. He's choosing responsibility over her, and no matter how good a person she is, that still hurts. As she says, as calmly and evenly as she can, because she doesn't want to force him to do anything, obviously. "But all these friends you told me about, aren't there any of them that you would trust to do the right thing in your place?" At which point we cut away to the rest of what was going on at the time. Steve goes back to the present, just like he does in the actual movie. Evil alternate timeline past Thanos comes to the future in his full armor with his weapon, and he fights the Avengers just like he did in the actual movie. But during the fight, we see little shots of Steve, even with all of the power that he gained during that fight, thanks to Mjolnir, taking on one guy after another. But every so often, just before he goes for one specific guy or another to save somebody, maybe, one of the other Avengers, specifically Sam, preferably, since he's the one that Cap ends up giving the shield to, gets there first and makes the save. And Cap realizes that even though he's important, even though he can do a lot, there are others who can carry that weight too. Like, he never outright says it, but maybe the footage slows down for a second and we focus on his expression, and he makes that "I just had an epiphany" expression that actors do nowadays. So later, when he hands the shield off to Sam, we can think back to that moment and be like, oh, that's what he realized in that moment, that Sam can do this in his place. That there is somebody he trusts, and that's Sam. Now, I freely admit my version of events isn't perfect. I'm not going to try to claim that it is. There's even probably a better place to put that conversation between Steve and Peggy. We probably could have just had her catch him and then cut away from everything and then flash back to their conversation that happened in the interim after we first saw old Steve or something like that, so that a little bit more of what happened would still be revealed at the moment of that twist, I still believe wholeheartedly that a conversation like that had to be in here somewhere to remove that underlying suspicion that Steve came into this person's life and hijacked it effectively for his own selfish reasons. And it's only because we can infer that some version of this conversation did happen, because Steve's the kind of character who would tell Peggy what happened, and Peggy's the kind of character who would have demanded to know what happened, and then they would have had something resembling the conversation that I laid out here. That's just who they are. It's only because we can infer that I'm okay with things ending up the way that they did. I want to be clear about that. And it's worth reminding people that just because this happened to Steve, it doesn't mean Captain America Steve Rogers is gone from the story. He's still there. They can still bring him in as a character. It's just his role will be different. And this is still the MCU. Post-Endgame, a movie where we saw the Hulk accidentally invent technology to reverse people's ages. If that wasn't an Easter egg that they stuck in there as a means for future writers to potentially bring Captain America back, the original Captain America back, then, well, it was just a semi-funny joke, in which case it's still okay, but I don't think that's all it was. I think that was their out in case they ever decide they want to bring this character back into the action. They may even use it as an excuse to cast somebody new as young Steve. Maybe the machine has side effects. You know, in case Chris Evans doesn't want to do this until he actually looks like Old Man Steve. And I think it's worth reminding people of all that, because a lot of Captain America fans keep talking about the character like he's dead. First of all, there is a new Captain America now, and I believe in that new Captain America. And second of all, again, I already said it, he's still there. He's just gonna fill a different niche in the story from this point forward. We might not get to see him quite as often as we used to. And like, I hate that. As a fan of the character, I hate that, just like I hate what happened to Tony. But as someone who cares about this character and wants good things for the character, I'm also okay with it. I'm conflicted, but that's good, because I really get the sense that that's how I was supposed to feel in this moment. But yeah, I mean, that's it. That's my interpretation of Steve's arc, from beginning to a relatively definitive end, which can still serve as a jumping off point for future arcs. Far more easily, I think, than the ending to Hulk and Banner's character arcs, for example. So yeah, this one's good. I think this one's good. You are free to disagree with me, of course, but from a writing standpoint, from a thematic standpoint, save for the missteps taken to keep Steve's choice a twist in Endgame, I think this one was technically solid, and I do like it. But as per usual, I'd like to know, what do you guys think of any of the stuff that I put forth in this video? What are your opinions on Steve Rogers as a character in the MCU, primarily, since I didn't really talk about the comics in this one? He's a pretty different character in the comics than he is in the movies, man. And what are your opinions on his arc? I'm really interested to know. So let's get a discussion going in the comment section down below, or over my Discord, link in the description. But either way, this has been AJ22, and I will talk to you guys later.